Today on CityCast Chicago, Walgreens is without a doubt one of the area's most recognizable companies, but between closing stores and going from public to private, the pharmacy's brand really seems to be in decline these days. Let's talk about what this means for the communities losing their stores and for Chicago's larger business reputation. It's Monday, March 17th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Catherine Davis covers healthcare for Crane Chicago Business. Catherine, welcome back to CityCast Chicago.
Hi, Jacoby. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, good to have you in the building. Let's start with the latest. This month, Walgreens announced that it's taking itself private. It's been sold to a private equity company after being publicly traded for nearly a century. What will this actually mean for the Deerfield-based company, especially the jobs here?
Well, I think one of the most sort of stark changes that we're going to see here is just that Walgreens is no longer going to be a public company, right? Which means its stock won't be trading on the stock market. And as it becomes a private company, we will have a lot less insight into what's going on with the day-to-day at this company. Right now, as a public company, we know how many people Walgreens employs. We know how many stores it has. We know how it's performing financially, what revenues look like, what profits or losses look like. And we have a pretty good insight into where this company is headed right now. Once this deal closes, which is expected to take place by the end of the year, Walgreens might go into sort of a black box. We will just know so much less about what one of the largest companies and employers in Chicago is doing. And so you asked about jobs. I think right now we're sort of unsure exactly how local jobs may shake out, at the Deerfield headquarters. But what I do know is that even ahead of this private equity deal with Sycamore Partners, Walgreens was closing hundreds of stores. We know jobs were being eliminated in those closures. And so even under this new owner, I would expect for those closures to accelerate. I think last year, Walgreens said around 1,200 stores would be closing, and it's very possible that hundreds more are added to that list under Sycamore.
As of now, do we know how many brick and mortar locations of all different sizes Walgreens currently has?
So what we do know right now is that across the Walgreens Boots Alliance company, which has pharmacies here in the U.S., but also in other countries in Europe, they have about 12,500 locations total and employ more than 300,000 workers.
And I know there are north of 100 plus stores across just Chicago. And so across the state, I imagine that balloons up and up. And as you describe this, it feels like going from public to private really may end up being a concern of transparency, how much we know. And in your article, some of the executives around this deal say, by going private, we don't really have to get caught up in the headache of the day to day, seeing the numbers go up and down. So they were almost saying it as if this allows us to hone in, focus a little bit more without so much public pressure. But the way you describe it, it almost sounds like they're able to sort of recede from public pressure and do things with a lot less scrutiny.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two sides to this. If you're a CEO and you're trying to operate a giant public company, having to talk to industry analysts, report all of your earnings to investors, deal with the mean media, folks like me that are beating up on you all the time, that is really time consuming. And it can be, I think, a distraction for an executive team that's dealing with a company that is in dire need of a turnaround. That dealing with the media, dealing with investors, that is ultimately taking time away from, maybe working with your customers or finding new strategic partners, right? There's certainly some credibility to that argument that, a business, once they go private, can just sort of execute on their goals quicker and faster without the distraction. But for the public and for a company that is so consumer facing, I have heard from experts in the field just sort of what the public loses by a company like Walgreens going private. And it's ultimately just that transparency issue where we'll know less about what they're doing, what they're thinking, how they're performing. And, you may have a less of a heads up that your local store is closing. Right now, Walgreens is telling us how many stores they plan to close. And usually you can get some information from them about what states or cities they may target. Under private ownership, we may not get any announcements or heads up about those changes moving forward.
And as we've covered time and time again, especially with you on the show, Walgreens not only employs thousands, but it's a crucial site for medicine, for daily food, for household essentials for so many people across Chicago neighborhoods. I don't think we can understate the pervasiveness, influence, and trillions of dollars in assets and money that private equity firms collectively have. And it's only growing. One author described it simply as, if it can be in any way marketed or monetized, private equity firms have bought it. International soccer clubs, water supplies, hospitals, dentist office, music catalogs. The list keeps going on and on and on. And often the vibe I get in these stories, Catherine, is that firms come in, they slash and burn in a way that's beyond just delivering for stakeholders. It's like maximizing profits at all costs. And it sometimes reads as a very like the boogeyman is in the room with us kind of feeling. Is this story and this particular firm in your like reporting, is it giving off these same slash and burn vibes?
I totally hear you on sort of the sentiment that private equity's become a dirty word. Private equity firms have sort of garnered this reputation for slashing and burning just because we've seen some really poor outcomes at private equity owned enterprises. I cover healthcare, so I'm relatively familiar with some of the examples we've seen among hospitals, for instance, where hospitals are declaring bankruptcy several years after a private equity owner came in. And, that ultimately creates care access issues for usually poor and disadvantaged communities. So Sycamore, what we know about them so far is, that they sort of specialize in buying companies and then breaking them up. They're trying to find ways to optimize businesses they buy. And in the case of Walgreens, we've so far seen some reporting that they would try to break up the U.S. Pharmacy business from the UK Boots chain pharmacy business, and then also sell off some of the healthcare assets that we could talk about later. But I think one thing that is certain to happen is they will continue closing the stores Walgreens has already identified as underperforming, and maybe even add more to those as they, really try to ramp up efficiency, boost revenue, and ultimately boost profits. Because a private equity firm, they're usually, they're short-term investors. They may own an asset for 5 to 7 years, but essentially they are looking to flip it. And once that 5 to 7 years comes, they need to either sell it to another private equity firm that thinks they can do something else with it, or take it public again on the public markets. So profit is certainly the MO here.
This episode is sponsored by Babbel. Are you holding back on foreign travel plans this year because you're afraid of the language gap? I'm not, because I have Babbel. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I'm learning Spanish on Babbel, getting ready for a trip to Mexico City. Babbel is the language learning app that gets you talking. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by over 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or at whatever pace you choose. Babbel's tips and tools are inspired by the real-life stuff you actually need when communicating. With a focus on conversation, you'll be ready to talk wherever you go. Babbel has given me great lessons on getting directions, ordering in a restaurant, and making plans. And of all the things I'm doing in Mexico City, I'm probably most excited about the soccer game we're going to. So I was excited to learn how to cheer from Babbel. That'll be me you'll hear yelling, "Fuerza Tigres! Fuerza Tigres!" With over 16 million subscriptions sold, Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by a 20-day money-back guarantee. Let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting our listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/citycast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/citycast. Spelled BABBEL.com/citycast. Babbel.com/CityCast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
This news came shortly after Walgreens announced it was closing 5 Southside stores at the end of February. I mean, given everything you just said, should we expect more South and West Side closures in the, coming months? And are we likely to have a heads up next time around?
I don't have any inside information on where more closures here in Chicago would be. What I do know after talking with the company is that they're targeting stores that they have designated as underperforming, which means, they basically aren't breaking even. They're unable to cover their costs in certain stores. And, sometimes that is related to theft, they say. They call it shrink. That's how they describe it to investors, where they say that too many things are being stolen from a store to justify it being there. But in other instances, sometimes foot traffic just isn't high enough in a particular store and it's underperforming, or maybe they have too many locations too close together. So, maybe they can consolidate down to one store in a particular area. Walgreens has not said that they are targeting any specific neighborhoods in Chicago, so I can't speak to that. But what I just described, I hope gives a sort of a image of how they are choosing which stores to close.
Yeah, I was looking back through some reporting on them, and an article from 2017 said they were close to 140 stores. By 2020, it was closer to 120. And so the decline has been happening for years and years at this point. Have you gotten any sense from just, customers, what it means to them to lose a neighborhood Walgreens?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen reporting, from some of our peers here in Chicago about just how devastating this can be for certain communities, especially if a Walgreens was maybe the last standing pharmacy in their neighborhood or in their area. Walgreens is providing, essential prescriptions for folks. Sometimes it's also essential healthcare services like vaccines. We also know, some of the Walgreens locations even have sort of primary care or doctor's offices in them. And maybe that is, in certain cases, the only healthcare access someone has that's close to their home. We've seen reporting that for certain folks, if a Walgreens near them closes, now they're forced to travel farther for prescriptions or that type of care. And that can really be difficult for a community, especially if they're seeing other retailers in their area close down as well, whether it be pharmacies or supermarkets or other retailers. And one issue that we've seen in Chicago, but also across the country, is just the proliferation of pharmacy deserts. And I think that's the real sort of threat and concern and fear that some Chicago neighborhoods have at this time. Is just, well, if Walgreens left, if CVS left, if Walmart left, where do these folks go for essential services?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, one reporting said between 2009 and 2021, close to 840 pharmacies closed across the state, average of 70 closures a year. And there are some zip codes in Chicago that don't have a single pharmacy in that zip code. And that's across, there are some that only have one. 8 zip codes have just 2 pharmacies. And so it's definitely not just Walgreens, but the compounding problem of more and more stores leaving out of these communities and concentrating in fewer and fewer neighborhoods really has already taken a toll. It feels like this is just like a kick while people are already down type situation. Why did Walgreens have to do this? We've gone on to talk about debt and a few other things, but if we had to maybe button it down to a few reasons, why is Walgreens taking itself private, essentially?
Well, I think it's 2 main things. Walgreens, like its competitor CVS, they've been squeezed on the pharmacy side by pharmacy benefit managers, which are essentially the middlemen of the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmacy industry.
Does that mean like a lot more direct to individual services? Or like a lot more third party companies have gotten in, like selling them cheaper?
Yes, I would think of a pharmacy benefit manager as like a third party they say that what they're doing is helping insurance plans negotiate better rates for drugs directly with pharmaceutical companies. But, once there is a middleman in there, they have to be paid. So they're taking maybe 10 off the top, so to speak. And pharmacies like Walgreens and CVS have claimed that these middlemen are making the entire ecosystem more expensive for consumers, but also squeezing them in the process. Aside from pressures from PBMs, Walgreens, like other retailers, is just facing more competition from e-commerce. More people are ordering toothpaste and shampoo and those sort of personal care items online, and fewer people are going into a Walgreens or really any other physical store for that type of good. The second big piece of this is, and Jacoby, we talked about this before, is Walgreens' sort of transformation they embarked on several years ago to turn themselves into a primary care company. They partnered with VillageMD, a local primary care company, trying to offer primary care and management of chronic conditions to Americans, which was so different than their traditional business.
We talked to you a couple of years ago about Walgreens' attempt to move into the primary care space. The title of that episode was literally, "Will Walgreens Become Your Doctor's Office?" Because they were planning to open hundreds of primary care clinics as they were closing pharmacies. Has that panned out for them in the ways that they've hoped?
Well, the short answer is no. And the longer answer is that particular strategy is a huge part why Walgreens is even selling itself to a private equity firm now. I think we chronicled back then that Walgreens was spending billions, $6 billion or so to acquire healthcare assets. And the entire idea was to attach VillageMD clinics to existing Walgreens stores. And that plan didn't really pan out. What we've seen in their earnings over the last 2 or 3 years since they really revved up that strategy is that they just haven't been earning enough money to support it. And because they took out so much debt to finance those acquisitions, they've really been falling behind. They've been posting losses quarter after quarter. And ultimately, it's just looking like, either no one wanted to get their healthcare from Walgreens, or the market was already too saturated and competitive, and folks are sticking with the doctors they were already going to. Healthcare delivery is also just a tremendously expensive and difficult business to be in already. We know that hospitals, even the big enterprises like Northwestern Medicine or Advocate Health, they are operating on really slim margins. And it's not really the type of business that's going to satisfy investors on the public market.
So with the potential that Sycamore wants to offload Walgreens stake in VillageMD, does that mean people might lose access to their primary care?
That's actually a really good question. I do know that Walgreens has been closing down VillageMD offices that, they've deemed as underperforming, which just means they're not making enough money to cover their costs, essentially. In those instances, yeah, you could certainly see whenever there's a closure of a primary care office, any doctor's office, any healthcare service, that raises questions about access for folks. And if they are losing their doctor and need to go find another one, which, as we know, can be very difficult, right, in the current healthcare system. I would expect that we may see more closures of VillageMD clinics under Sycamore, but that's only if they are unable to find a buyer for VillageMD, and they've been very vocal about the fact that they want to offload this asset. I think that sort of the next story here is just, well, who wants to buy VillageMD? We've kind of gotten every indication that the business is struggling.
You talk about that 5 to 7 year timeline where their hope is to sell it off, to flip it, to maybe go public. But is there a chance that in, 3 to 5 to 7 years, Walgreens could be filing for bankruptcy?
So I've talked to experts who, head of the Sycamore deal, coming to fruition were warning that Walgreens was on a road to bankruptcy. I think that is just sort of the state of the company right now. Even before Sycamore, experts, industry analysts were saying, if Walgreens doesn't turn this around, bankruptcy is in the future. Right now, the promise with Sycamore is that they will be able to turn Walgreens around, avoid bankruptcy. Of course, if Walgreens goes bankrupt, Sycamore loses money on its investment here. So they're totally incentivized to prevent that.
The private equity company is based in New York. We're expecting job cuts at the Deerfield headquarters. Does this, if anything at all, say anything about Chicago and the Chicagoland areas, the state of our legacy businesses and brands, like the confidence we have in Chicago as a place for thriving businesses?
I think that perception is definitely real. It's hard to say how true it is. I mean, as you know, Walgreens, while it's going through a particularly rough time right now, it's also been one of the most successful public companies in the Chicago area for the last 100 years or so. And there's so many new companies, sort of coming up behind it and growing into big public corporate giants that employ hundreds, thousands of people and do many things for this local economy. I think the biggest fear with Walgreens being sold to Sycamore is just that the ultimate control of the company won't really be in this area. It won't be in Deerfield anymore. It will be in New York, where the Sycamore investors work and live, presumably. And I think that sort of gives people pause, just because, once a company, the control of a company moves somewhere else, there's just maybe fewer, incentives to make sure the company has a good relationship with the local economy, with the local regulators, with, even the workers in that area.
Community advocacy organizations, things like that.
Sure, exactly. You would imagine that Walgreens has such a big impact on the local economy of, Chicago, but just think about what it's doing for Deerfield with all the people it's employing in that area, the big, real estate leases it has. It's paying a lot of taxes in that area. And I think people are concerned that some of that is at risk when control goes to another geographic area.
Catherine, what are you going to be watching not only once this deal is approved, but, over the rest of 2025?
Walgreens isn't off the public markets yet. It's still going to be releasing some earnings in quarters to come. So I'll certainly be watching those closely, just trying to get a good idea, before we lose complete insight into the company, how it's performing. Are revenues increasing? What are profits and losses looking like? How many stores have they continued to close, and where are they? Those reports will give us such good insight going into this private era, so to speak. I think more broadly, I'm watching how private equity is infiltrating Chicago and Illinois healthcare across the board, whether it be at pharmacies like Walgreens or hospitals or medical supply companies. Medline Industries, you may be familiar with. They're a local medical supplier, and they took a big private equity investment a couple years ago, and we're watching them closely to see, what sort of the outcome of that deal is. Are they going to go public? Are they going to be sold again? And those deals have huge ramifications for the local economy here.
Catherine, I really appreciate you making time to join CityCast Chicago today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we get out of here, please bookmark our website, chicago.citycast.fm. There you can subscribe to our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago, catch up on old podcast episodes. You could rummage through our events calendar. And next week, that's where we're going to be dropping today's good news. It's our official 4th birthday here at CityCast Chicago. And on our website next week, we're going to be dropping our 1,000 things we love about the city. Y'all, like every list we put out, we did our best to go in every neighborhood all around the city, get some of the most specific and the most general Chicago examples. Some of my favorite Andre Brower performances, the Katie Got Bands dance, down in the beer on the walk from parking lot G to Sox Park, mutual aid organizations. It's so many more on this list, y'all. Again, tap in with our website. Top of next week, we're going to have that full list for you. We appreciate everybody who contributed to it, everybody who listens to the podcast, reads the newsletter already. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace.